Hello, welcome to episode, I believe, 16 of Defense Against the Dark Arts. I'm Paul Miil, and this podcast is Defense Against the Dark Arts. Or is it the Miil podcast? Or is it Paul Miil Talks? I'm not. Whatever. You're here. You found it, which is amazing because I'm sure all the algorithms of Google and iTunes and everybody else is trying to block this stuff because nobody wants rational, critical thinkers out there, right? It's not going to benefit anybody but the critical thinker. So, anyways, continuing on from yesterday, whatever that day was, the last video of arguments. I'm going to continue on with today is about the validity of arguments to test how is an argument valid or is an argument not valid. And I'm going to be continuing using the words reason or premise. I'm going to interchange those words. So if you hear me say premise, I mean reason. Like, what's your premise? What's your reasons? Why? Why do you think that? What's your premise? What are your reasons? And I'm also going to interchange the word with claim and conclusion. So what are you claiming? What's your stance? What's your conclusion? Right? So I'm going to interchange those as I think I did last time. So today we're going to be talking, like I said, validity of arguments. And when we talk about the validity of an argument from a logical point of view, we're talking about the form of the argument. It's critical that we completely understand the simple concept of the if-then conditional statement. If, we have to stress if X is true, or if something is true, then the result would be Z, or whatever your result is, right? So it's a conditional. If this, then that, right? If. We're not saying that, we're not saying Z, we're saying if X is true, then Z. So, right? Everybody's got that? Simple. This statement has a form that is conditional. And I'm going to stress, we're saying if something is true, then Z, or whatever. So the statement's not saying that the thing is true. The conditional if-then statement is only saying that if something is true, then Z, then whatever the second part is. So it's a simple concept, but it's a critical point to grasp when we're talking about valid arguments. So valid does not mean true. Now, just hold your resistance for a second here and just hear out this complete concept of what a valid argument is. A valid argument is not the trueness of an argument. A valid argument is about the form of the argument. When you hear the word valid in terms of logic and arguments and reasoning, we're referring to arguments. It doesn't mean it's true, right? So it means the form is correct given certain conditions. But the valid argument can be false. Here, let me say that again. It's an argument where it's impossible for the reasons to be true and the claim to also not be true. So if, here we go with the conditional, if then. If the reasoning is true, then the claim has to be true. That is a valid argument. But we're not saying that the reasons are true to be a valid argument. We're only saying that if the reasons are true, then it is impossible for the claim to also not be true. That is the form of a valid argument. But if the reasoning is not true, it is still a valid argument because we're talking about the form. We're talking about the if. If that statement is true. So the if. So we're talking about, we don't know if that statement's true or not. We're just saying if that statement is true, then the logic dictates that it is impossible for the conclusion to also not be true. But the reasoning can be false in the proper valid form. We're just saying that if that is true, then you're right. This has to be true. It is impossible for this to not be true. That is the form of a valid argument. So we can have a valid argument in form where it is impossible for the claim to be false if the reason is true. But the reason may be false and the argument is still valid. All right, it's still a valid argument if the reasons are false. A valid argument only means that if the false reasons were true, then it would be impossible for the claim to be anything but true. So what's an invalid argument? An invalid argument is where it is possible for the reasons to be true and the claim to be false. Right? We're talking about possible. So we're not saying the reasoning is true or the reasoning is false. We're just saying that it's possible that if the reasoning were true, it is possible for the claim or the conclusion of the argument to be false. That is an invalid argument. So we're not saying that the claim is even false, right? It could be valid, or not valid. It could be true. The claim could be true, even in an invalid argument. But the form of the argument is invalid because it is possible for correct, true reasons to come up with to not support the claim. So the claim could be false, even if the reasons were true in the form of that argument. So when we're looking at an argument, we should be asking ourselves, is it possible for the reasons to be true and the claim to be false? If so, it's an invalid argument. And if we hear an invalid argument, it doesn't mean that the argument is wrong. It just means that it's not logically sound. It means it's an unsound argument, and it means they have no standing. It's invalid. So you don't care. It's not telling you anything. It's a waste of time. If somebody gives you an invalid argument, it could be true or maybe it's not true. So it's not a valid argument, right? So it's not proving anything. Where a valid argument, if the reasoning is true, would prove it would be impossible for the claim to be false. So therefore, a valid argument is a sound argument, or a valid argument can be a sound argument. Here, we'll go into this in a second. So whenever we hear an argument that is worth listening to, the first thing we should do is evaluate this argument. Listen carefully to the wording. Is the argument a valid argument? Is it impossible for the reasons to be true and the claim to be false? We don't know if the reasons are true or not. We don't know that. They're making these assertions. We don't know. This is the whole point of an argument. If we knew, we wouldn't need to listen to them, right? So we're listening to their argument, and we're listening for, is it impossible for the reasons to be true and the claim to be false? But there's no guarantees either way with an invalid argument. So an invalid argument is a waste of time. You can just quickly negate them by saying that is an invalid argument because it is possible for your claim to not be true, even if your reasoning is true. So even if your reasoning is true, I don't know if it is or not, but even if your reasoning is true, it is possible for your claim or your conclusion to be false logically. Without knowing anything else, I can deduce that your argument is invalid logically. So it doesn't matter if your reasoning is true or not. I don't know. It doesn't directly lead to your claim that you're claiming. So therefore, your argument is null and void. It is invalid. So we don't care if they're telling the truth or not. We don't care if they actually do know something or not, because the argument is invalid. It's not proving anything. So there are no guarantees either way with an invalid argument. There's a model in reasoning that claims that only truths can be deduced from truths. Falsehoods can never be deduced from truths. I don't like the absolute wording of this. The idiots who write this crap are supposed to be experts in logic, yet they gloss over conditions and make statements of absolutes that are not absolute. So the reasons given in an invalid argument do not guarantee its conclusion. It's possible to be false, but it's also possible to be true. An invalid argument does not guarantee the claim is false. It just means it's possible for the claim to be false, and therefore it's void. We don't care because we don't know. It's not proving anything. Any argument that uses statistics is an invalid argument because it's possible for the claim to not be 100% true, since you're using statistics and probability. Since the reasons are statistical and they're based on probability, it is possible for their claim to not be true. Therefore, an argument with statistics using statistical reasoning is an invalid argument. The same thing goes with causal and analogical reasoning. Yeah, using analogs. Analogical? Yeah, that's how you say it. Analogical reasoning. Analogical reasoning is reasoning using analogies, right? We'll cover that in probably an upcoming podcast, maybe the next one. So you might have heard the expression, that is a sound argument. A sound argument is not the same as a valid argument, but a sound argument is a valid argument that is true, that the reasonings are true. So a valid argument with a true premise or true reasoning, and therefore a true claim, is called a sound argument. That means it is proving. If we know the reasoning is true in a valid argument, and we know that it's impossible for the claim to not also be true if the reasonings were true, then we know that it's a sound argument and their claim is valid. We know their claim is true. So that is a sound argument. A sound argument is an argument that is, yes, you have convinced me because that is true. It is impossible for it to not be true logically. And however we ascertain that your reasoning is sound, if your reasoning is sound and then logically your argument makes it impossible for the conclusion to also not be true if your reasoning was true, and your reasoning is true, therefore you have a sound argument, and therefore your claim is true, and therefore you've won us over, right? You have a sound argument. So a valid argument with a false premise or false reasoning, regardless of how true the claim is, the claim could be true. It could be a true claim. It's called an unsound argument because the premise or the reasoning is false. So I think everybody's hopefully catching on. I don't know how I could stress this anymore, but so an invalid argument that might have true premises and have a true claim is still an unsound argument because it's possible for the claim to not be true, regardless of how true the reason or the reasonings or the reasons or the premise or premises are. So when we say an argument is sound, we are committing to accept that its conclusion is true. Any other argument is unsound. Any other argument is unsound. So the only sound argument is a valid argument in which the premise also happens to be true. If it's a valid argument and the premise is false, it's still a valid argument, but an unsound argument. And we're not committing to the argument's claims being true or untrue. We're left hanging as an unknown. So it's a waste of time. If you don't know, either or, it's 50-50, it's a flip of a coin. We don't know if it's true or not. It could be true. We're not saying it's not true. But we also don't know that it is true. Therefore, it's an unsound argument. It's a waste of time. A valid argument has a very specific meaning, and a sound argument has an even more specific meaning, which I hope I've elucidated, if that's the word. Elucidated? I think. Well, we'll Google that later. So we can go further to say that the only good argument is a sound argument. Now we're entering another word, good. What's a good argument? Right? Well, I'm just going to say good argument is a good argument. All other arguments are bad. The word good is synonymous with sound. So it's either a good argument, which means it's a sound argument, or it's a bad argument, which means it's an unsound argument. Right? Pretty straightforward. So even though a valid argument can be unsound, only a valid argument with a proven true premise is a sound argument. So all the other arguments are just useless. They don't prove anything either way. So good means sound, bad means unsound. So to summarize, a valid argument is about the structure of the argument where the premise implies the conclusion. An invalid argument, the premise does not imply the conclusion. A sound argument, the premise implies the conclusion and the premise is true. An unsound argument, the premise does not imply the conclusion, or at least one of the premises or one of the reasons, if you have multiple reasons, is false in a valid argument. So if you have a valid argument, say you got 5 reasons leading to a conclusion, and one of those reasons happens to be false, even though if logically it would be force it to be true, the conclusion, if it was true, then that is an invalid argument. This is easier to grasp with examples, so I think I'll give you an example. All girls are human. All humans are animals. Therefore, all girls are animals. So this is a valid argument. If the 2 premises are true, then the claim has to be true in this form. So this argument is valid. But this argument is also sound because, in this case, both premises are true. So this is a sound argument, which means the claim, all girls are animals, is true. Here we go. Here's another example. All guitars are instruments. All instruments are used in a laboratory. Therefore, all guitars are used in a laboratory. This is a valid argument, but one of the premises are false. So the argument is unsound, and the conclusion is not guaranteed to be true. So the form is all A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C. You got it? So that's the form of a valid argument. If there's an argument that claims all A are C and all B are C, therefore all A are B, is not valid. All men are human, all women are human, therefore all men are women. This is an invalid argument, and therefore it's an unsound argument. You got it? So I think that's pretty much good enough for today. I'm going to run out of time here, so we kept this under half an hour. That's pretty good. So see you next podcast.